Part 2.
You will hear an interview with an adventurer, Colin Clark, about trekking through the Sahara Desert. First, you have some time to look at questions 11 to 15. Now, listen carefully and answer questions 11 to 15.
After years of planning, Colin Clark finally got the opportunity in the winter of 2002 to visit and trek through the magnificent Sahara Desert. Earlier today, I talked with Colin about the trip and recorded this interview. Colin, thanks for taking the time to talk with me about your recent adventure. Tell me, how many days did the trip end up taking?
It wasn't one of the easiest things I've ever done, let me assure you. Even with the assistance of my two travel companions, it was more difficult than I had expected it to be. Let's see, the first day was the 4th. Yes, we arrived back on the 18th, so all told we spent 14 days trekking through and around the Sahara. Although it only got really difficult after the third day. Out in the Sahara you can forget about your nice comfortable bed. Try as I might, I couldn't get comfortable at night, so after day 3 I was feeling weary from lack of sleep. Fortunately, that changed after a few days, but those sleeping bags took some getting used to.
And how did you travel?
Well, most of the trip was either in a four-wheel drive by land or by river in a type of canoe which the natives call a pirogue.
What was the weather like?
Winter season is the dry season. In fact, our guide told us that it hadn't rained in winter in 20 years. Out in the desert, people don't even bother setting up a tent. They just jump straight into a sleeping bag. You can imagine our surprise when on day 8 we encountered a little light rain. Anyway, on our first day, and I remember this moment well, the sun had just begun to rise. I was sitting on the roof of the four-wheel drive photographing some of the landscape. At that very moment, we knew we were going to be in for some scorching weather. It was only about 8 a.m. and the roof of the car was getting too hot to sit on. I asked the guide if he knew what the temperature was, and he said it must be at least 85 degrees. That's Fahrenheit, by the way. And this was supposed to be the cool of winter. The rest of the trip was pretty much the same, although at night there was a considerable break in the heat. One night I even needed a blanket, which is pretty common at that time of the year, but it was never that cold.
Before you listen to the rest of the conversation, you have some time to look at questions 16 to 20. Now listen and answer questions 16 to 20.
Highlights. I assume there were many, but are there any moments that really stand out above the rest?
Yes, I'd have to say the simple pleasure of camping out in nature, especially at night, was a highlight. The light of the moon and the stars was just breathtaking. Not a sound to be heard in the still of the night. I won't forget that amazing experience. On day 12 we arrived at the Niger River, where we had to take a ferry across to Timbuktu. You don't know how uncomfortable a four-wheel drive can be until you've bounced around in one for 4 days. In most parts of Africa you have to drive through mud and deep potholes to get around, and this was certainly the case travelling to the ferry. When we got to the river, there were 26 vehicles waiting to board it.
Wow!
But I'll tell you, finally arriving at the Niger River and getting out of that four-wheel drive was a much welcome break, which I won't forget. The ferry itself was built to hold 5 vehicles and was supposed to take an hour and a half to make the return trip. We realized it was going to take a better part of a day to get on the ferry, so we decided to take a pirogue over to Timbuktu with our luggage, which was another highlight for me personally. The pirogue is an interesting form of African transportation. Basically, It's a modest-sized vessel which resembles a dugout canoe. They're a common way to travel a river in that part of the world. They range in size from 2 to 6 person, but they never carry those numbers in Africa. It's not uncommon to see a pirogue built to carry 2 people actually carrying 8 people, or the larger 6-person size with 20 people on board. But it has to be people that don't place a high value on their life.
I see.
Most of the pirogues are propelled by hand, but a few have motors. There's a larger canoe that they call a pinnace. These are actually quite large. Almost all the pinnaces have a motor and are used mostly for freight or cargo. I'd have to say that I'm very pleased to be safe at home.
That is the end of part 2. You now have 30 seconds to check your answers to part 2.